I'm Jan Gibson, and I'm Program Chairman for the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation. Our mission is to protect the historic visual character of Lake Forest, and we work hard at doing that. This year I was trying to figure out whether to go with Edwin Hill Clark or Harrie T. Lindeberg. And Harrie Lindbergh is one of my favorite architects, and I asked the Tom if he would be so kind to talk about Lindeberg, because he designed such beautiful structures. And with that, I give you Tom Rekovich.
My first thought is to thank everybody for skipping spring break this year, just so you could hear me talk about Harrie Lindeberg. My second thought is that, and I mentioned it to some dear friends who are in the second row here, that I'm grateful to Governor Blagojevich for moving the election up a day so that it wouldn't interfere with the talk either. Putting that kind of silliness aside, I think that the appropriate way to begin is to recognize that the reason why everyone came, I think, is actually not because I'm talking, but rather because Harrie Lindeberg's the subject, and rightly so. But there's an interesting thing that happened 60 years ago, almost to the day. Lindeberg wrote a letter to a colleague of his, Williams Adam Delano, another magnificent New York architect, in 1946, in which he said, "I am ashamed to confess that the work from which I get the most pleasure covers the little jobs which most architects would scorn. The houses I have built are scattered throughout the country and are important only in that they are appreciated by my clients and enjoyed by their friends." Here was a man who, at that point in time, he was born in 1879, so he was nearly 70 years old at the time, was looking back on a career that we're here to celebrate, in at least his contributions to Lake Forest particularly, and he was sort of lamenting that he hadn't done enough, or maybe he hadn't done anything of worth. So quite apart from the jokes about the governor moving the election, it's clear that all of you are here for one very important reason, and that's to see the work that he says that he's ashamed to confess he was involved with. I am by training an architect and not an historian, and so I don't intend to dwell on dates or family histories in the way that someone like Art Miller can so brilliantly do, and he weaves a story which I wouldn't even begin to try to compete with. Instead, I'd like to bring some of an analytical mindset to looking at Lindeberg's work and try to understand better what his formative influences were and how those things affected the architecture that he made, particularly here in Lake Forest. To put all of this into context, I think it's useful to remember that again, as I said a moment ago, Lindeberg was born in 1879 and lived until 1959, so he lived to the age of 80. In that lifespan, he accomplished much, but he lived that lifespan concurrently with a number of other architects with whom you're familiar, and I think it's useful to sort of have in your mind who else was doing what while Lindeberg was alive. Howard Van Doren Shaw was born in 1869 and died in 1926, so 10 years older than Lindeberg. David Adler was born in 1882, so he's 3 years younger than Lindeberg, and he died in 1949, the same 10 years before Lindeberg. Edwin Lutyens, this magnificent arts and crafts English architect, whose work we'll see a little bit of a little later, was born in 1869, the same year as Shaw, and died in 1944. And Piet Mondrian, whose work you see here on the right, was born about 10 years after Lindeberg himself. The two images are a way of making or sort of marrying with this idea about dates and who was doing what and when, to give you a little bit of a sense of what was happening. While Piet Mondrian was doing this panel, about within a 2 or 3 year period of time, David Adler was designing the Kersey-Coates Reed House that you see on the left. And while Edwin Hill Clark was designing this structure, which I had a slide of that in particular, he's done many beautiful buildings, but that's the Plaza del Lago in Wilmette. Exactly at the same time he was doing that, Vasily Kandinsky was doing this oil painting that you see on the right. I would suggest that it's fairly clear that there was an amazing disconnect happening between the visual arts and architecture, and I would suggest that that disconnect was happening for a fairly specific set of reasons, having to do with the nature of how one builds buildings. which ultimately, even with all the progress in technology that was occurring at the time, still was bounded by certain things like gravity, and also among architects, I think, of that time, about a sense of a tradition of language, architectural language, a way of designing buildings. Now, we don't know a lot about Lindeberg as a young person. We know that he was born in New Jersey to parents who had immigrated to the United States from Sweden. His father was a clothing seller, and they were quite poor. He was one of only 3 kids in his family who actually lived past the age of 1, Harrie Lindeberg. The other siblings, most of his other siblings, died. Lindeberg did not receive any formal architectural training at all. So unlike people like David Adler, who of course studied famously at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was a magnificent institute for the study of classical architecture, Lindeberg was more like a sponge, absorbing the things that he found around him, and he was fortunate enough to get a job in the New York offices of McKim, Mead & White. Many of you are probably familiar with McKim, Mead & White. It was one of the most magnificent classical offices in the United States, and really the first large-scale architectural practice in the United States. Lindeberg managed, after a short period of time in McKim, Mead & White's office, and this would have been beginning in about 1904, he managed in fairly short order to be working under Stanford White, who was one of the 3 partners and probably the wildest rascal of the bunch. Stanford White later died at the hands of a jealous ex-husband of Evelyn Nesbit, who was a Ziegfeld Folly girl, and I think many of you know parts of that story. Stanford White was the mentor to Harrie Lindeberg, and so while Harrie Lindeberg was in his office, he was looking at the kinds of classical architecture that Stanford White was interested in. But at the same time, again, in this period of about 1905, 1904, you have other things happening elsewhere, and Lindeberg was clearly at least as interested in those other things as he was in the work of what his own mentor, Stanford White, was designing. Here you see examples of 2 projects by Edwin Lutyens in England, one of many practitioners, probably the greatest practitioner, though, of the arts and crafts movement. He was also certainly familiar with books which were being published at that time, including a book called Country Houses of Today, published in 1907. These are some images from that book, and you can see that sort of predominating characteristics that one associates with English architecture. And in particular, I would just note, and obviously these are all evident, the tall and very pronounced chimney masses, very steeply sloped roof forms, interspersed with gabled elements for indicating entryways and secondary entryways, and fundamentally a very simple and in a sense, earthy palette of materials. Each of these projects was really being built from material that could have been gathered in the area immediately near where it was built. So the brick was taken from clay that was available in the local soil. The tile roofs were likewise made from fired clay, or in some cases thatch, which we'll see a little bit more of later. And so the architecture was also about a sort of craft expression of how one could most artfully assemble those materials into architectural compositions. And this is the work of another contemporary of Lindeberg's, an office in Philadelphia, Mellor, Meigs, and Howe, the partners of which were essentially born in almost exactly that same year that Lindeberg was, all of them born in the late 1870s or early 1880s. Mellor, Meigs, and Howe became one of the foremost practitioners of an English picturesque style in the United States, and their location in Philadelphia undoubtedly was within a circle of people that Lindeberg would have known, and certainly he would have become very early on in his career familiar with what they were doing in their career. Their work, I think, is uniquely American, and yet it's clearly derivative of, as we saw in these previous slides, a very strong English influence and a similar palette of materials. Now in McKim, Mead & White's office, and I couldn't get a slide of it, but in McKim, Mead & White's office, Lindeberg was working on a residence that Stanford White was designing called the James Breeze residence, and that residence was based very much on Mount Vernon. It looked a lot like this building, which amusingly enough is the Tracy Dow's residence designed by Lindeberg about 4 years after he left McKim White's office. Here's an example of, in a sense, an homage by a former student to his mentor, and also, though, at the same time, a reaching out to try to better understand what was the sort of fundamental character of American architecture. Lindeberg was really not interested so much, nor was Stanford White particularly, in trying to specifically recreate a European architecture. Rather, they were looking for ways in which you could use a classical language of architecture or even a vernacular style and create a building which was absolutely American and of its place. The project, the James Breeze residence in McKim White's office, was the last project Lindeberg would work on. Just as that project was being completed, Stanford White was murdered, as I mentioned before, on the rooftop of Madison Square Garden, a building he had actually designed. At the same time, Lindeberg saw this as a moment to strike out on his own and begin a practice. So we're at 1906 now. And Lindeberg left McKim White with a fellow employee named Louis Colt Albro, who became his partner in architectural practice for a period of 8 years. In 1914, the partnership dissolved. But they each brought their own sort of distinct way of thinking about architecture to the table. And Lindeberg was very much interested in the picturesque stuff that I showed you, like Lutyens' work and the work of Mellor, Meigs, and Howe. And I think, looking at their work in that period, in the initial period when it was Lindeberg and Albro and Lindeberg, you also recognize classicizing trends, examples of symmetry, strong symmetries. And those, I think, are manifestations of the fact that Louis Colt Albro in particular was more enamored of architecture like that. 5-part compositions, very much like the things that you see in David Adler's, much of David Adler's work. Their first project together was the James Stillman residence. Are we able to focus this a bit? The James Stillman residence was their first project, and it was a great project to do. Stillman was related to the Rockefellers. It brought a lot, it brought a lot of prestige to them that they worked on this project, and the project was absolutely remarkable because in the midst of a sort of flourish of architecture that was happening right at the turn of the century, prompted in large part by McKim White's interest, a lot of buildings were starting to look like that. Think of the World's Columbian Exposition of a few years earlier in Chicago, and you think of this sort of trend toward classicism. Albro and Lindeberg designed a building which looked like this. And at that point in time, the whole Latter-day Stockbroker Tudor movement had yet to exist. This was considered an utterly shocking thing because Mr. Stillman was a person of money. In fact, the Esquire after his name, I think, gave clear indication, and this is an image from the monograph on Lindeberg, which was published in 1940. This was a person of great wealth, and yet Lindeberg was interested in projecting to the world, at least to the immediate world of this person's friends and associates, that there was a sort of return to a gentlemanly countryside existence. That James Stillman was really quite happy living in a thatched cottage out in a farm-like setting, and that he really had no particular pretensions toward the wealth that he had actually acquired. That's the caretaker's cottage on the left. The caretaker obviously lives better than most of us today. The interesting thing about this, and again, this literally launched a career. This is one of those things, it's like Frank Gehry when he did the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum. Lindeberg and Albro did this building, and the next thing you know, they were inundated with work. They used actual thatch on the roof and then later replaced it with shingles, and Lindeberg wrote an entire article about so-called thatched effects with shingles, talking about how you could steam the shingles to give the illusion of this sort of undulation of thatch. And you can see on this, the shingles have already been put on the building. The interior of this, surprisingly enough, and maybe this was clearly Lindeberg's hand designing the exterior, but the interior of it was probably more Louis Colt Albro, and it was Parisian classicism. So imagine going in the door of this building and finding yourself, or passing through a porte cochere that had elements like that, and finding yourself in a building that looked for all the world like a house on Park Avenue in New York. As I mentioned, Lindeberg had this fascination with thatched roofs, and in part that emerged from what I had discussed earlier, this interest, this deep interest in English arts and crafts architecture, and at the same time interest in how you could take new materials, in his case the wood shingles that were then being mass produced in the United States and sort of the beginnings of the industry of shingle production, wood shingle production, and how could he use that in a building. And it's with that first step that we get introduced to Albro and Lindeberg arriving in Lake Forest at a house that we now all know as Two Gables on Green Bay Road. The structure was built in 1910. Lindbergh depicted it like this in his monograph. He specifically selected a view which amplified this sort of picturesque notion. There was no sort of strident symmetry in that view. He wanted to make clear that this was a country retreat. And yet if you look at the plan of the house, and you've probably all driven by it, it's a simple bar-shaped building running east and west to provide a maximum amount of exposure toward the south, with a service wing perpendicular to that running to the north, and a porte cochere so that service and servants were as invisible as possible. So again, while the architecture suggested almost a peasant class in a way, although on a grand scale, the way in which the disposition between public use, the so-called the served, and the servants was very, very strongly distinguished, and it's very clear that he wanted this part of the house to simply serve as a foil or a backdrop to the architecture of the main part of the plan. Now, these are photographs that have recently been taken of Two Gables. As you probably know, that beautiful thatched roof effects in shingles led, after a number of years, to a horrific fire which damaged much of the upstairs of Two Gables, which was originally the Armour residence, and the Lawrence Armour residence. And as a consequence, David Adler came in and did remodeling work. But what you see here, by and large, is Albro and Lindeberg, at least in these images. And again, you see the sort of clear disposition of the formal entry court, and it's based very, very overtly, not just on 16th century and 15th century English prototypes, but at the same time, those things that he was seeing in the books, these sort of revivalists that were a part of the arts and crafts movement in England. And there on the left, you see the porte cochere passing through. The project has been, this house has been really beautifully restored by Legacy, who has been involved with a number of historic houses and historic properties in Lake Forest. And Rocco Di Filippis and Bruce Grieve were both kind enough to allow me to take a few pictures to help you see the fact that this building actually lives on quite well today. Lindeberg was absolutely, as was Albro, Lindeberg was absolutely interested in the development of craft detail. And so what I would suggest is that you look at two things as you see the slides, and then this will be throughout the rest of the work as you see images of buildings in Lake Forest. Note that each individual element of the design that he wanted to emphasize was what I would refer to as vignetted. In other words, he made a little sort of still life composition of each of these things. Lutyens, Edwin Lutyens, whose work I referred to earlier, the English arts and crafts architect, was famous for designing buildings that had an anthropomorphic character, meaning they resembled a human being, in particular a human being's face. And you would often see pairs of windows and doors that look like a human face. And here you see Lindeberg doing that, with these windows being like the eyes and this being like the sort of gaping mouth, with the light fixture that would have hung here being like the nose. Equally important, though, you see Lindeberg and Albro setting up a very discrete, highly symmetrical composition in the midst of a wall that then had various asymmetries on it, but as a way of emphasizing that as a part of the development of the plan and the primary axes, the primary lines of movement you would have undergone as you went to the house, for instance, in the front door. The symmetry is locally emphasized. So you get certain things happening, like the paired windows and the dormers, that sort of hyper-emphasize the symmetry of the elements that they consider to be important in the composition of the plan. Now, interestingly enough, when you get to the garden facade of this house, all of that half timbering, the wood with the stucco in between, utterly disappears, and suddenly the architecture becomes at least moderately more formal. Interestingly enough, we see, and you'll see other images of it throughout the talk, that Lindeberg seemed to have this propensity for making the entry side of the building rather austere and at times almost unfriendly. And then the garden facade, which was obviously exclusively for the delight of the owners and their guests, became this much more inviting and ultimately much more sort of balanced and architecturally sort of vivid composition. Here you see aspects of that south garden-facing facade. Lindbergh also, and this is probably Louis Albro's involvement back when the house was first built and they had it photographed. Lindbergh also had one axial photograph of the garden facade, the south facade. And I just thought it was useful to compare it with what we have today and to find, in fact, that we have a building very much like what it was. One of the few changes is that Adler created more formalized dormers when he put the Ludovisi clay tile roof on. Lindbergh's were much more in keeping with that arts and crafts tradition that had existed earlier. But notice even things like the lunette above the door for where a sundial is positioned, a sort of strongly classicizing element introduced in the middle of a composition which is otherwise, again, still sort of 16th century English. The next project that Lindbergh did in Lake Forest, and this is still in the period of time where he's working with Louis Albro, and just at the end of it, in fact, is the Clyde Carr residence. Although here we have none whatsoever, and clearly their relationship was souring because you could start to see the work being more overtly either Lindbergh's or Albro's in who was doing the more symmetrical or asymmetrical compositions. The Clyde Carr residence, which some of you have probably been in. It was the owners of the house were gracious enough to have it as the holiday party open house for the Preservation Foundation this past winter. But you'll notice that Lindbergh comes up with a plan which is really, in a sense, at least on the face of it, here, there, and everywhere. But if you look closer within the plan, there are still clear lines of symmetry and clear axes running through, connecting the entry hall through a small parlor hall, through the stair hall, the living room, and a sun porch. And then what he does is dispose to the side of that, as they had at Two Gables, you have a service wing and a little service motor court. Lindbergh at this point was also beginning to introduce an extensive employment of garden walls as a way of shaping space. There's a part of Lindbergh that I think longed for the English village as much as he longed for the freestanding English cottage. And so increasingly you see garden spaces or courtyard spaces shaped both by the architecture itself as well as by garden walls and hedgerows and whatnot. So there's a very specific sequence but also a sense of enclosure even when you're outside. These days many landscape architects refer to some of what he did as making so-called outdoor rooms. Well, Lindbergh was obviously about 100 years ahead of the curve on that, but in fact he was simply looking to the great historical works that he admired so much. A few years later in Dayton, Ohio, he does a plan which has a similar sort of disposition of rooms, except in this case the angle is used to embrace southern sunlight. The south is up this way. And so the angle, the inflection of the plan, the fold in the plan, if you will, is used to get sunlight from the south. But again, this perpendicular disposition of a service wing, he's constantly separating the so-called the served spaces from the servant spaces. The slide on the left is an image of a project by Lutyens, which I think it's reasonable to say was an influence on Lindbergh. Lutyens' work was constantly published in Country Life magazine as he was designing these things. He was one of the darlings of the editor of Country Life magazine and found his work frequently published, and well deserved. Lindbergh would have known that publication. He would have known it well, and clearly at the entranceway here on the right to the Clyde Carr residence, he's strongly influenced by some of the sort of the geometry of this hyper-emphasized gable. This is a form not really typical to any periods prior to the arts and crafts in England, and here you have Lutyens very much emulating that. And once Lindbergh had something like that he found to be elegant and refined, he was very, very comfortable using that then as a component of a language, as a piece of architectural language, and using that on other projects, but never in a monotonous way, and never in a way where it was outright a repetition of what he had done before. There was always some variation on a theme or a new piece of invention that allowed him to actually take elements that he found to be compositionally attractive and use them on subsequent buildings. So you see in 1925 in Dayton, Ohio, the Frederick Patterson House, which you saw the plan of, and in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1919. One of the things that Lindeberg was also able to do when he had a design element like that he was interested in was modulate it one way or another and either make it more formal or more rustic, both by the selection of material palette and then the ways in which he detailed the materials that he used. This is the west-facing, the garden, or not the garden front, but the side yard of the Clyde Carr residence. And here we begin to see something else that Lindeberg did that actually became essentially a trademark of his, the so-called big hat roof. He, like Lutyens and the English arts and crafts architects before him, and even the medieval English architects before them, was enamored of this very discrete, simple, clear-cut disposition of forms. So essentially, you imagine him composing these houses as though you had a series of volumes, a series of boxes, so to speak. And he would see how best to compose them. He was doing that on the floor plans of the buildings at the same time that he was doing it on the elevations of the buildings. That ambidextrous ability to be able to work with floor plans and volumes or elevations at the same time is a real challenge, and as was the case with people like Adler, certainly, Lindeberg mastered it and had an enormous sort of facility doing that. Here too, look, if you think about what I described about these sort of vignetted conditions, look at the way he composes that volume, even though this wing is wholly a part of this. There's only a small setback between this section and this. But notice the way that he creates this piece perfectly symmetrically. He makes this sort of picturesque bow window in this section above the bow window down below, and then finishes it with a porch. He's setting up, in a sense, a series of picturesque events that are participating very much in that part of the architectural tradition he most enjoyed. Here, in other locations on the same house, you see more of a sort of predominance of the half-timbering work, and even this sort of distinction of second floor versus first floor. All of these are clearly drawing off of traditions which predate the arts and crafts, but where Lindeberg is sort of bringing it into how he treats things. So you get this magnificent, narrow piece of space that slides down, which if you look at nearly the same time at the work of some of the early modernists, you find these narrow slots of space and framed views. In fact, Lindeberg was using the wall to emphasize long axes like this from very early on. And as well, this image from an English house published in that book, Country Houses of Today, in 1907, and an image from his monograph of the Clyde Carr residence showing this sort of marriage of stonework and half-timbering, and this sort of prominent disposition of chimney pieces. Clearly, the influences were very, very strong. A later project of his on the left, where he started to embrace timber work and the possibilities of that, which he also saw in Lutyens, and the timber work on the same Clyde Carr residence here in Lake Forest, simply showing you that he viewed that timber work as part of a craft vocabulary that he began to employ. And maybe even more poignantly, this image on the left, which is a project by Edwin Lutyens, which he would have known very well, and the relationship between chimney mass, and even if you see the string or the band course, the soldier course here, and the splay back on the chimney, and Lutyens' similar use in an equivalent position, the separating out into three parts of the chimney mass. Lindeberg used the sweeping part of the roof to come out over this projecting bay, but clearly there was an influence. Also, in Lutyens' project here, you see that the beam is set back and you get this sort of recess that fills out the width of the masonry. Lindeberg sets back a splayed brick wall to a window itself. Clearly, the projecting timber work of the balcony, the baluster turnings of the spindles, clearly this is an influence that was very vital and vibrant in Lindeberg's mind at the time. At the same time, he was doing other interesting things. If you look on the roof, he began something which you'll see more of later. He built undulations in underneath the roof shingles by literally, and I've worked in restoring a number of Lindeberg houses here in town. He built literally planes of planking underneath to create the undulation and put the shingles on the top so that it sort of emphasized this sort of picturesque character, which in fact Lutyens didn't feel the need to do. On the left is again, only a year later, a project by Lindeberg in New Jersey, and which I happen to think is one of the most magnificent combinations of timber. You see the timber going through the arch surrounded by the brick. one of the most magnificent combinations of timber, masonry, and ironwork that I've ever seen. And here Lindeberg at the Clyde Carr residence using decorative metalwork but about 6 years later the metalwork was added by someone whose name I need to make sure I'm getting correct, Oscar Bach. Bach was a German metalsmith whose specialization was in Art Deco. And he was employed to do these magnificent figures and also zodiac and astrological signs as part of the metalwork, the decorative bronze work, and the grills at the Clyde Carr residence. Lindeberg built into, and this is very much in keeping with that arts and crafts tradition, and very much unlike things that you would have necessarily found in McKim and White's work, these decorative grillages, that some of which, like the peacock that you see on the left, is utterly magnificent. And here you see a series of animals, including a fine Labrador up there, at the Clyde Carr residence. And simply a few more details, including what had originally been an open passageway through the service wing of the Clyde Carr residence. The owners were kind enough to let me put a few interiors up. You won't see many interiors today. In part, I've worked on a number of these houses, and out of deference to my clients' privacy, you won't see their interiors because I think that that's kept properly private. But in the midst of all that half-timbering work that you'd seen in the earlier images, for the exterior, just like on that James Stillman residence that they began their career with in 1906, you see this suddenly high-style classicism taking place inside. These paired, very, very sort of slender and delicate Corinthian pilasters on the wall, a fairly muted cornice, which is not necessarily overtly Corinthian. If anything, there's a sort of an Art Deco influence to the cornice, and this magnificent oval sitting room that I think some of you saw, with very low relief panels in wood and plaster. So in 1914, Louis Colt Albro leaves the office, and with him this sort of gesture, this is in 1914 in Long Island, that sort of gesture of the symmetrical building goes away. And if you look at that building, I think you even see remnants of the Lawrence Armour, the two Gables design. Granted, the ends are now sweeping roof forms, and that's probably Lindeberg's influence, but the symmetrical disposition of the plan is probably Albro's. With that change comes a whole new sort of enthusiasm for the picturesque, but also a wide variety of approaches to floor plan making on Lindeberg's part. Here in 1921, I'm going to just show a series of plans that he did before we return to looking at specific buildings in Lake Forest, just so you can see how utterly inventive he was and how interested he was in making and containing exterior spaces with the buildings that he did. In other words, he didn't simply place an object on the ground, although one could argue that there are aspects of that in this. By the time Lindeberg's on his own, he's making these magnificent shepherd's crook garden walls that sort of meet and counterpose the curve of the service wing of the house, which was clearly simply meant to be a backdrop to set off the entryway here and the formal rooms of the house through that section. This is the Van Buren residence. Is actually a stable structure, and you see that here Lindeberg actually got to take that whole notion of a courtyard even further and literally create an entirety of a court on three sides with a wall that completed the fourth. And you see that he's really very much operating in that picturesque tradition, timber, brick masonry, clay tile, flat clay tile roofs, or wood shingle with a thatch effect. Here in Connecticut, you get this magnificent splay of the wall again in a much more humble scale residence, where again the servant spaces, the laundry rooms and whatnot are placed in a wing to the side and simply are used to set up the sort of crown jewel of the composition, which is the entranceway to the house and the formal rooms of the house. Or here, the Hamley residence, and this is quite a bit later, this is all the way into the 1930s, but this magnificent sort of service court here, the terrace off of the end of the house, but then the formal room still facing directly to the south. At the same time, and again, with this, to put this into a time period, we're talking about around 1920 that Lindeberg is evolving in his style. And he's sort of been away from Lake Forest for a while. So since Clyde Carr in 1916, he sort of hasn't been seen. And it'll be 1926 before he shows back up in town. But you get the beginnings of plans that create more formal courtyards. It's almost as though he's starting to miss Louis Albro. And so the plans start to make entry forecourts, which are symmetrical, often defined on their sides by servant spaces, and then the primary public rooms, which again invariably end up pointing to the south. And if you go around Lake Forest and look at his houses, you'll see that there's a fairly consistent pattern, that he orients all the public rooms to the south, and he often puts the library across the hall from those spaces on the north to protect the books. Now, in 1926, he did a project for the Van Buren family, and that building, which exhibited these characteristics I'm describing. It was on the one hand slightly rustic, but at the same time began this symmetrical sort of U-shaped entry court condition, and often resulted in wide varieties of plan arrangements behind that. But that symmetry and this sort of prominent and symmetrical garden front or entry courtyard front became something that suddenly was associated with him much more so than any people really remembering him having done that first James Stillman residence, that cottage-like building. On the inside of that, though, he immediately went to high-style classicism for these structures because, again, there was this important sense that he needed to make certain that people understood that when they came as a guest that there was the appearance of a certain humility to the architecture, but when you got inside there was a clear demonstration of the wherewithal of the people who built the houses. Again, in 1926, he's back in town, except that instead of doing something highly symmetrical, he does what I think is maybe one of his most magical small projects, the Lowell Chapin residence. This is very close to that Clyde Carr residence, and you see very clearly French influences now. So in that, I think it's clear that he's adopting some of the formalism that was in the office when Louis Albro was there. But at the same time, you still get these picturesque conditions. So you get the high roof, his trademark, and the roofs sort of crown each of the localized compositions. So you get the composition of the entry, you get the composition of the main block, you get a composition of a kitchen wing on the side, each of those things sort of independent vignettes. When Lindeberg got to a moment that he was designing elements that he found effective, it would not be unusual for him to repeat them. So here you see the Lowell Chapin entranceway, which again I completely adore. We're doing a project there now. And then later, about 10 years later, that residence and that entryway. The sort of simple, discrete piece of limestone surround at the entry and ironwork above. One of the things that was said to sort of define Lindeberg's work was a simplicity. He wasn't concerned, particularly in the exterior, with all these sort of adornments that one might associate with the work of somebody like Adler or Edwin Hill Clark. But rather there was, again, this sort of simplicity that seemed to rely more on the inherent integrity of the materials he was using and how they were best sort of assembled than it was about creating ornament. And when he did create ornament, like a cornice, it was often by simply rotating a brick rather than building it up in some grander scale cornice. This is a comparison of the front and the rear. The turret here is the stair tower of the building and sits at the rear of the house. Poor Jan, we're going to have you focus every time. And you see this undulation that's been built into the roof. This is all the original undulation that he did. You see aspects of that sort of arts and crafts character. And I have to apologize, that slide's actually reversed. But you see aspects of that arts and crafts character on the house. But at the same time, there's clearly, again, this French influence.
Where's this house, Tom?
In Lake Forest. For the sake of discretion, it's near the Clyde Carr residence. If you know where the Clyde Carr residence is, it's near there. And here you see an example of Lindeberg getting to a point where there was something compelling to him about a particular architectural form and then using it again. This about 10 years later, or no, 6 years later, this project for Irving Brokaw in Oyster Bay, New York. And I would ask you to note there, up on the roof, up on the peak, the Indian that I think we all associate as being the Anwensia Indian, which if Lindeberg developed that as a weather vane for the Anwensia Club, then a handful of years later he must have found it equally charming still, or he had the sample and convinced Mr. Brokaw that an Indian on top of the finial would be lovely.
Wasn't that a Todd Hunter weather vane from Chicago?
It may be. I don't know that. I just know that when Lindeberg went back to Oyster Bay, he did it again. And here's some other details. The development of this articulated garden wall that gets a gate that bumps up, and the wall actually inflects to accommodate the gate. This is the garage structure at the back of the house. The tower that you saw would be at the left here. And then this magnificent ironwork, in this case it's by Samuel Yellen, another metal crafter that he worked with extensively, and interestingly a metalcraft ironsmith who was renowned in Philadelphia, and in fact did a lot of work for that office that I mentioned earlier, Mellor, Meigs & Howe, so much so that Mellor, Meigs & Howe actually designed Samuel Yellen's business, the office where he, or the shop where he did his ironwork. But here's this magnificent farmer with a hat on to protect him from the sun, and a pitchfork for the hay. This is an existing door handle. Next slide. So now we find ourselves in 1927, and he's doing the Anwensia Club. And the Anwensia Club allowed him to investigate formal symmetries, which again, as we've discussed, became an interest of his. This ongoing use of the sort of vignette, localized vignette composition, meaning that in parts of the building he would make these highly symmetrical and sort of balanced compositions, very pleasing individual positions, and then combine them into the whole. And I think many of you are familiar with it. Obviously, the formal part of the building where the club's activities take place is in more or less a square donut with some projecting wings, and the locker rooms and other service areas are off to the side. So again, you see this very thoughtful and sort of comfortably done separation of the more formal aspects of a project from the more informal. Next slide. So here you see the character, and if you think of the slide I just showed you, and suddenly you see this character shift where the dormer surrounds, instead of being brick as they were on the main building, suddenly are done in wood. The roof line runs through. It makes the clubhouse and other part of the locker rooms and whatnot, in a sense, subservient to the kind of higher formality that one finds in the main part of the building. There it is. And here the sort of intermediate court that separates the two parts of the building. Next slides. And again, just to emphasize these sort of vignetted compositions, these localized symmetries, which I think are sort of a hallmark of his work. It's probably one of the reasons, to my mind, that his work is so enduring, is that he had a simplicity about the compositions, and yet they're utterly satisfying, both proportionally as well as the material palette. And so here you see that the roof does not continue past the window. The window surround is done in brick. There's a corbelled development of the brickwork to create a cornice. You get coining on the corners. The surrounds are done in a sort of an architrave-like surround is made for the window and door openings. Originally this was all whitewashed, lime-washed in fact. And you didn't hear it here, but it would be lovely for them to do that again. Another vignetted composition of the doors with the urn above. This sort of triangular composition is very common in his work. Next slides. And then just looking closer at these really thoughtful and simply done details, like the thinly turned balusters that are very much like Marie Antoinette's Petit Amo at Versailles, or this heavier timber structure that evokes some of the timber work we saw in his earlier projects. Next slides. The formal terrace, this is the two little extended wings at the back of the main block of the building. And again, you go back to high style, the development of the cornice work and brick detailing above, the segmental arch with brick voussoir work. Next slides. And then just a few interiors that demonstrate his mastery of the simplicity of materials in the form of the timber ceiling and iron railing, which I think is spectacular, and then a more formal approach in one of the gallery halls surrounding the courtyard. Next slides. So now we step forward. The Anwensia Club clearly was, as Lindeberg didn't need an introduction to Lake Forest at all, because he had done some magnificent buildings for the Armours and for Clyde Carr, but that Van Buren residence and the working on Wednesday led him to get other projects, including the Robert Gardner residence. I think this focus is better. I'm just going to tape your finger to it, Jan. There we go. The owners of this house have done, I think, a wonderful job restoring it, and we have been very careful about doing that project correctly. This is a view through the porte cochere, which again becomes sort of a ubiquitous element in Lindeberg's work, and the photograph from his monograph that showed how that looked when the project was first built. Next slides. Next, yes. Next, yes. And again, the rear terrace, where suddenly, and you see the photograph from the original monograph, the rear terrace where the architecture actually becomes sort of more noble. Again, just like on the Armour residence where you get a higher level of formality on the south facade, which is the garden facade, and a greater level of austerity on the entry court facade, you see it manifest here. And here you see the compositions, these vignetted compositions inverting. So you have essentially an inverted pyramid entry doorway at the entrance court. That's how guests arrive. And the slide on the right is the garden court facade. And once again, I would suggest that even though the surround is an identical profile in Kasota stone, a golden Minnesota limestone, here you get a sundial above, and on the other side, simply the transom light. And again, this really, I think, thoughtful but simply done series of vignetted compositions, whether on the projecting wings on the garden facade, with the development of the bay window below a single window above, or even here where the projection, the thickness that was required to accommodate the chimney and the fireplace, he broadens it out across the entire facade to the point where it virtually touches the end windows. It allows the roof to sweep down a bit further, which is toward the street, which gives it a little sort of quieter demeanor toward the street. And then he puts the living room windows out at that surface rather than simply articulating only the mass of the chimney. And then he diverts the flues so that you can have a window in the center for a powder room. And that porte cochere looking back out toward the street, once again, these sort of localized symmetries that he did. After that, and we bump forward to 1929, the Dexter Cummings residence, I think, has a clear debt to the beginnings of the direction he was developing on the Lowell Chapin house. In other words, he's beginning to adore the French. And he's doing it in a way, though, that again is uniquely American. There's no sort of overt Frenchness to this, but rather simply one has the sense that this is a house that one could find in France, not simply because of the pleached and pollarded trees in the courtyard, in the entry courtyard, but also, as you'll see in a minute, the development of some of the detailing. Again, the plan where the motor court is here, the building makes a sort of a U shape toward the garden, and the service wing is sort of out of the way and actually hides essentially behind a garden wall. You have there's a garden wall here, and those service spaces, many of them are tucked in behind the wall, with some of them continuing behind that. It simply serves as a backdrop to enhance the formality of the central part of the composition. The owners of this house as well have recently engaged an interior design firm that has done a really, I think, a magnificent job with the owner's support in making the interiors of this house look just fantastic. So here you see the entryway. If you think back to that entryway at the Lowell Chapin house, that house that I said was sort of French, the little cottagey house, here you see him taking it up to a higher style of classicism, a more refined classicism that certainly owes more to the tradition of people like Vignola or Andrea Palladio, and then their followers, people like Inigo Jones and William Chambers and others in England, but a magnificent little sort of focal point, and then again this sort of triangular compositions, the pyramidal composition, two windows, one above two, and then the multi-part composition at the center, and you see the image that Lindbergh created of it when the house was first built, or photographed when the house was first built. At the back, architects at that time tended to have pretty substantial libraries, and I'm I've spent the last 20 years of my life trying to acquire a lot of the same books that they had because I try to design buildings like this, and so it's always interesting to me to see what their points of departure were. And going through this book, which is a book on minor country houses and also chateaux of France, I found this image, which again I would suggest is dramatically like what Lindeberg was doing. This is a book that undoubtedly Lindeberg would have had in his library at the time. We don't know Lindeberg's library inventory, but we know David Adler's, and these books tended to find themselves in the hands of all the great practitioners in New York. So here you see even this magnificent tower at the end and the arcade that occurs here with a roof terrace off of it, as the roof terrace exists on the Dexter Cummings residence. But Lindeberg's is a little more sort of rational. Lindeberg's architecture is, I think, a little more straightforward than its historic precedent. His is clearly more about the geometry of the cadence of the windows. Obviously, you have a window that aligns at the beginning, and then after that it's just equal spacing, whereas on the bottom it's equal spacing, so you go from 7 windows above to 5 windows below. And just a closer look at, and you can see here, for instance, a much more vigorous development of a masonry cornice, a brick cornice, including shaped brick, which one doesn't typically get with Lindeberg. Normally you'd find the brick rotated or used in some other fashion with a conventional shape of brick as a way of creating shadow and also articulating something of importance like a cornice. Here Lindeberg actually had shaped brick made, and when he published his monograph in 1940, obviously many years after this was built, he included this cornice, a close-up photograph of that cornice work, as a detail that he was clearly particularly proud of. And these masterful details at the corner, I would call your attention particularly to this intersection. He created an octagon above and a rounded corner square down below. So as this curve reconciles itself with the octagon, you see the brick doing this magnificent detail. We're going to revisit that in a half of a second. When Lindeberg does classicism, in this case, they're Tuscan columns, so they're the simplest, most austere order. And I think he did that because he really was eschewing a kind of a bigger embrace of decorative detail. This was, again, he was embarking upon the making of a uniquely American architecture, very much unlike Adler, who I think was more interested in evoking as fully as possible the specifics of the architecture that he was imitating. So if he was doing French architecture, he wanted you to be convinced that it was utterly French. I think Lindeberg very much didn't want to make a building that was overtly anything other than American. His work obviously was from the period of time when you had Cole Porter and the Jazz Age and Teddy Roosevelt early on, and these are things that I think very much would have influenced how he thought about this country and about the idea of making an American architecture with a simple series of forms. And just additional details of that. In 1930, in Lake Bluff, Lindeberg did a building called the Earl Reynolds residence. Sadly, this building is no longer a residence, and so it's very, very difficult to get any good photographs of it. It's used as part of the, I guess it's called Chicago U Medical Center. It's pretty far north, up into Lake Bluff. Here, though, you see the reappearance of that cylindrical tower. You see the sort of corbelled brick detailing that provides just the simplest accentuation of that particular form. And you see a floor plan which, again, turns all the primary rooms to the south. It puts a porte cochere across perpendicular to that, and in that sense, this floor plan is very, very much like the Robert Gardner floor plan that I showed you earlier. Now on the left is an image from the monograph of the work of Mellor, Miggs, and Howe, and you see the porte cochere marked by this very sort of slender little cupola up there. Theirs isn't even on center because Mellor, Miggs, and Howe wanted you to think that these craftsmen were just putting it together instead of working from 400 sheets of drawings, which is what Mellor, Miggs, and Howe used to do. And Lindeberg, who would have known of that project when he designed this residence, and Lindeberg clearly admired the work of Mellor, Miggs, and Howe, the Philadelphia office, this small little porte cochere with a similarly slender little spire marking it. Also, I mean, we're at a point in time now, but by 1930, that Lindeberg is increasingly coming under the influence of interests in modernism. And while he used that Art Deco metalsmith, Only on the interiors do you see any overt embrace of some of the detailing one might expect in Art Deco work. But the austerity sort of kicks in, so you get the kind of detailing you find here, some of which prefigures the next project that we're going to look at, which is probably one of his most stylistically overt projects he did. But you see the original rendering, and here inside in a section and in a side view, the entranceway of this Earl Reynolds project, and it's located here, and it's a curved form that has to intersect a rectangular wall, and he does that same step-back corbel brickwork as a way of denoting the entrance. In the midst of all these other buildings, Lindeberg did two other structures that I'm not going to show you. One of them was a residence for A.A. Sprague in Lake Bluff, which was a house like that white clapboard house that I showed you way early on, that he had worked on shortly after he left McKibney and White's house. A house that was very much like Mount Vernon, white, American clapboard, symmetrical. The house, sadly, has been through a lot, I said diplomatically. And as a consequence, there's really no vestige of it to show to you, but it should be noted that that was a project that he did. Interestingly enough, it's also the only house that he did here that didn't make it into his monograph. So perhaps the reason it got mistreated was because they felt slighted when in 1940, after all these things had been built, Lindeberg, along with his daughter, published this monograph. At the time he was 61, and I think in the closing years of his career, but he did that monograph to try to drum up business. This is this sort of right in the middle of World War II, and there just wasn't a lot to pay the bills. Lindeberg had some big bills. He had a beautiful house that he designed for himself, and that the A.A. Sprague residence doesn't make it into there. The other project that you won't see a slide of is a round sort of turreted garden wall on Green Bay Road just south of Ragdale, which has been attributed to Lindeberg, although I haven't seen documentation to convince me that in fact that was his project, that garden wall, but I trust those who've done that documentation. So we come to 1932, and it's Philip Danforth armor, and it's Tangley Oaks, which was restored by a client of mine for use for their business, which is a wine importing business, because the house was simply too immense to really be used as a house any longer. And once again, this goes back a little bit to the beginning of the talk. You have all these people who are amazing stewards of really, really great pieces of architecture. And at times you come upon a piece of architecture that's awfully, awfully hard to justify saving, either because of the size of it or because of the arrangements of the spaces. And once in a while, and in this case it was one of the once in a whiles, you get lucky enough to have someone be creative and think outside the box and find a good use for it and then take good care of it. This was one of the original gatehouses to it, which has now been converted long before my client got involved into a single-family residence. But it gives a hint of the higher formality of the house that one would find. The garage structures, however, are right back. Here we are in 1932, but Lindeberg is going straight back to Bailey Scott and all these magnificent arts and crafts architects from England with this long sort of sweeping roof and these little eyebrow windows pushing the roof up to make dormers in these locations. Sort of a geometric eyebrow, but they sort of raise up in the midst of this very sort of heavy leaden kind of roof. You just can't beat that, can you? This is the view across the pond. It was a view. Lindeberg created the pond. He was very enamored of the idea that this English country estate would sit in a setting that was as bucolic as the English country estates that he came to know. In particular, this magnificent house, and I apologize to anyone here who knows the pronunciation of it better than I, but Compton Winyates, this great English so-called pile of Gothic accumulations, and we'll see an entry facade of this that very much evokes that. But here the plan, where once again all of the primary public space is viewed to the south. The entry sequence is on an axis that looks out to the south, framed between two asymmetrically projecting bays, because here Lindeberg, again, probably for one of the very few times in his career, rather than doing this sort of uniquely Lindeberg American take on whatever the prototype was, he was really kind of doing English architecture the way he'd seen it done on study. The difference might be that he used the same brick color, which became a sort of a defining aspect of his work. the entrance to that, and 2 years earlier, the entrance that he had done to the church residence in Long Island, where you see this disposition of the oriel window to illuminate a stair hall that's positioned adjacent to and asymmetrical with the entry portico. And here, the entry portico, which gets its own oriel window, and then the larger flat window, which is the stair hall window. If I apologize, I tried to get a good photograph of Compton Winyates from a book, and it didn't turn out. But had I put that up side by side with this, there's little doubt whatsoever that this central part of Lindeberg's composition, this asymmetrical part of the composition, comes from there. And clearly he was very comfortable with this. This is sort of like going back to those roots in 1906. Here you see the development of the porte cochere, which was so much a part of all the projects we've looked at. And at Tangley Oaks, once again, you get it. And again, here's Lindeberg, 20-some years later, making a porte cochere that's not a whole lot different than that Lawrence Armour two-gable porte cochere, except it doesn't have the window above. These are images before and after the restoration of the house by the current owners, this wine importing company, which have been, I think they've done a magnificent job stewarding this house. They've made it available for public events. I think the Preservation Foundation did an event there. I think I spoke at it. And they're taking great care of a house that at 30+ thousand square feet would have ended up chopped up into condominiums, and the interior is probably destroyed. You see the service wing. Again, think about when we were seeing on Wensia Club and other places, how suddenly the architecture becomes much more humble, much more simple. So side by side with the magnificent oriel, you have windows that have brick surrounds rather than limestone surrounds, timber work above some of them, roof forms that aren't as balanced as the roof forms on the primary part of the house. And then some of the detailing, which I mentioned, was sort of seen earlier in that Earl Reynolds residence, with beautiful leaded glass caming inside, all of which has been restored. A lot of it was buckling. The Conrad Schmidt Studios in Wisconsin came and did that. Let me focus this. This is what, on the left is one of the conditions of the place when we got there. I worked with them actually on the acquisition of antiques, among other things, and they had antiques, but we acquired additional ones, and this is what it looks like today. A beautiful entry vestibule to the women's powder room. Lindeberg, I don't have, again, a lot of photographs of Lindeberg interiors, but he often used these magnificent chinoiserie wallpapers, hand-painted Chinese wallpapers. The wallpaper in this house was actually restored by a curator from the Prints and Drawings Department at the Art Institute. It was restored by hand by them. They were cleaned and then re-adhered to the wall. The wallpaper is 18th century wallpaper. And then the mantelpiece, which is also an antique mantelpiece in the main sitting room. Detailing of the linen fold panels, which Lindeberg used frequently, particularly in those houses that had more timbering work on it. And then a view from inside that leaded glass looking out on the terrace, sort of from the inside of that same thing. We did wall sconces and other things. All the sconces in the building had been plastered over, and so we actually designed sconces to replace them. At the very end of his career, in the late 30s and early 40s, Lindeberg was commissioned, among other things, to do embassies for the United States and Russia in Moscow. And here on horseback, you have these with sort of Monticello and Mount Vernon and other places sort of looming, Redlands and other places looming there. Lindeberg shows, American embassy staff riding on horseback around a wooded landscape that looks a lot more like Virginia than Moscow. And you see the river running through the city and the smokestacks, but he's kind of created this perfect little Jeffersonian-like, almost like a University of Virginia campus. And then in Shanghai, in China, this magnificent, and here's him being inventive with his plans again, this sort of splayed open pair of low buildings with the high tower in the background. The project was never built because of the war. And it's sort of a shame, but you see aspects of sort of Art Deco. One almost recognizes some of the Lake Forest Post Office, at least the feel of that in here. And it's right, obviously, on the waterfront. A house that he did in I think 37, is it? No, in 32, for Country Life magazine. Again, notice the sort of the beginnings of him yielding. He'd sort of held modernism at bay for an awfully, awfully long time. God bless him. And but at a certain point, I think either owing to a certain lack of will and old age or something, he started deciding that he maybe needed to go with the trend. When in fact earlier he had done things as magnificent as this. I'm going to conclude with a quote that comes from the introduction to his monograph that was written by an architectural critic of the period, Royal Cortisot. And he says this: "Technique is not the last word in architecture. Behind it all is what a man has to say and how he shapes at the problem before him. A man may have the whole paraphernalia of architectural detail, the order of the classic, the machinery of the Gothic at his fingers' ends, and yet may fail to impress us. The essential point is whether he has any vision of his own, any fresh outlook on facts, any new version of their relations, whether he has a definite and original personality." And I think here you're hearing somebody describing somebody who's not David Adler. He's describing Harrie Lindeberg. "For the personality of an architect is shown in his work as clearly as that of a painter and sculptor in theirs. The architect's likes and dislikes, his ideal, his temperament and outlook are written in his work in ineffaceable letters. An architect is an artist or he is nothing. It is true that he faces his problems with a whole armory of resources. He's delved into the secrets of construction, which makes him akin to the engineer. He has knowledge of materials, which stamps him as the brother to the mason and carpenter. He has the instinct for sight, for ground forms, which allies him to the landscape gardener." You think about the beautiful sightings of Lindeberg's buildings. "But none of these things avail him if he is without the sensitiveness and creative urge of the artist. He may study endlessly and may have passed through arduous scholastic examinations, but let him lack inspiration, let him have no dreams, and he will function only in terms of the commonplace." So Lindeberg, very late in his life, looking at the work that he had done and sort of thinking back on it, made a sort of a simple remark about all of it. And he said that reason would last far longer than the novelty of the moment. Thank you very much. Ludovisi tile was made in Ohio, but also here in Chicago. In fact, one of the office headquarters for Ludovisi tile was Evanston. And there's a gentleman who's the son of one of the early salesmen for Ludovisi who has a company now. His name's Kenneth McGee. He has a company in North Carolina called the Tile Man. And he was telling me magnificent stories about his dad and where he lived in Evanston and these tile that he buys them now from buildings that are being demolished and then sells them if someone needs to repair or patch in or whatnot, or maybe if there's enough tile to do a whole new roof. But Ludovisi, I think their production facilities were primarily in Ohio. The clay came from Ohio. And Ludovisi as a company still exists that's owned by somebody. But unfortunately now, when that tile is fired now, it's fired in a gas kiln. Whereas in Lindeberg's time, it was fired in a coal kiln. So then it was fired at, I don't know how many 100 degrees, but it was a very, very, very slow firing process, which meant that it sat in there for a very, very long time. And so the baking of it, the darkness on the exterior, the character that the tile developed was really magnificent. They could control it a lot. Now it goes into this gas-fired oven and poof, it's cooked and it's out in like 2 hours, whereas before it was a week. And so sadly, you don't get the character that you used to get. So they throw stuff on the surface and burn it so that it looks similar, but it's not the same. It's not. They'll start making it again at some point when they realize that what they're making now is, is the equivalent of a, I'm not going to make that analogy either because I'm going to get myself in trouble. A hamburger by a major food chain compared to a good sandwich.
I've been looking at the reprint of Lindeberg's work. Yes, that's what all of us can afford. None of us can afford the original 1940s book. And I'm surprised to see in the book that it seems to me roughly half the houses in there fall into that classical colonial Georgian type of style that I think you were attributing to Albro. And I'm wondering, how many houses do you think Lindeberg actually built in that kind of style?
Oh, I think he built quite a few. But I think if you really look, if you go through the book, it's certainly not half. And there's actually more classicism that happens after Albro is gone. Albro died in 24, but he left the firm in 14. There's more of that classicism done after that, but I think in part because Lindeberg, like anyone, when you have a client, if your client says, I want you to do a Georgian residence, you're going to do a Georgian residence for them if you have the ability to do it. And I think that you probably see more of that either owing to clients who he hoped to develop a useful relationship with in the long term, someone who could actually find him other clients. He would do that work. But I mean, I think it's fairly clear based on not just on what he did in Lake Forest, but generally, if you go through the whole monograph, he's certainly leaning toward the sort of the picturesque in his work. And in some instances, there are a number of projects that were done for the same client. So sometime if he did a classical project, it was 2 or 3 projects that were classical, all for one client, like Gerard Lambert, the one house that he did. He was a Princeton University professor, I think, and he did a couple of different, he restored Carter's Hall in Virginia for him as well. So some few of those people had a profound interest in classicism. Again, there's no evidence anywhere that Lindeberg actually trained anywhere to learn the specifics of classicism. He was probably self-taught in all of that.
How do we not end up with any of those classic houses in Lake Forest? It seems as if we...
Well, I think that...
The picturesque and the French-style houses.
Well, I think Dexter Cummings probably gets you fairly close to that. It's not fully on board with that, but certainly the entry court is there. I don't know why. I don't know why. Maybe because, I mean, if I think about where those other ones are, some of them are in Virginia. And then I think suddenly the local tradition, Lindeberg was very much interested in local traditions, local palettes and materials. So the local tradition undoubtedly informed that in part. Also, some of them were row houses, townhouses. He did a townhouse in Manhattan. He did a townhouse, well, freestanding, but like a townhouse in Washington, D.C. And in each of those cases, I mean, in Washington, D.C., in Manhattan, the context was very different. I think in Lake Forest, I mean, who knows? He might have been acting as a kind of a foil to David Adler. He might have viewed his architecture, as an antidote. They were operating simultaneously, and then later, obviously, Adler got more of the work. But during that period, maybe he was, I mean, partly, you know, an architect establishes an identity with how they approach architecture. And Lindeberg, I think, looking at all these slides, you can see a kind of a Lindeberg building, a typical Lindeberg building. Adler's, we could kind of come to recognize because we're around them as well. And undoubtedly, he wanted to make sure that his stuff was somehow distinct from that. In ways, too, his version of arts and crafts is clearly nothing like Shaw's. It's nothing like Howard Van Doren Shaw's. So the influence, and he's only 10 years younger than Shaw. I think that the incessant use of brick masonry and occasionally stone was an indication that he was trying to make an original American architecture. And I think, as was Shaw, but just in a slightly different way.
Did he ever partner with a landscape architect?
He worked with numerous landscape architects. He worked with Ferruccio Vitale. He worked with Rose Standish Nichols. He worked with Jens Jensen. I mean, you find prominent landscape architects on all of his projects, but they tend not to get played up at all. Ferruccio Vitale's work was for the project, the Lowell Chapin residence that's there by the Clyde Carr residence, and the work that he designed for that was never executed. And it was much more axial and formal, and the picturesque aspects of that house, even though it's sort of French, wouldn't have necessarily married as well with what the landscape looked like, and never got executed. He also designed a substantial, virtually a doubling in size of that Lowell Chapin residence, the one that has the little witch's hat conical stair tower in the back, which was never executed, for the grandmother of the current owner of the house. I can't say enough about those families and people who've stewarded these houses, because really, in a sense, I mean, they're proving Lindeberg wrong when he thought that he wasn't doing much of importance by keeping those houses, you know, as wonderful as they are now. And they're utterly livable. I mean, Tangley Oaks in Lake Bluff at 32,000 square feet being one of those rare exceptions, but the other ones are utterly livable. I mean, and in fact, most of them have never had additions made to them because you didn't need to. You could take some of the servants' quarters and turn that into a family room or a casual sitting room, and they work perfectly well like that.
With Adler and Shaw living so close by, they could execute, these houses kind of hands-on. How much hands-on did Lindeberg have with these houses? Did he have to travel?
He had a Chicago office.
Oh, he did.
But it was like 1 or 2 guys. No one knows exactly how many people, but they have some of the drawings have a Chicago address on them. So at the very least, he had a space here.
Someone here to help execute on the job so that he was able to get a greater level of control.
Of control, yeah, absolutely. And I think, certain things repeat, and it's a whole separate lecture, but moldings on the interior, plaster moldings, you'll find them repeating on multiple projects, so clearly he had a vendor for that. There are things like that that happen on his work that suggest to me that there were certain things that he could fall back on and rely on for quality and for execution. But his protégés, the people who worked in his office, later went on. Maurice Facio, who's one of the great Palm Beach architects like Addison Meisner, maybe even better than Addison Meisner, was a Lindeberg employee who went to Palm Beach. And Lindeberg didn't do anything in Palm Beach, but Facio went down there and did magnificent things. John Staub, who's one of the great Houston architects from that same time period, was in Lindeberg's office and went to Houston and did some great buildings. Interestingly, none of those people made buildings that looked like Lindeberg's. So there was very much, in keeping with these photographs at the beginning of Adler versus Piet Mondrian, an interesting sort of comparison that this was an age of individuality. This was the Jazz Age, and people were making buildings that were sort of uniquely theirs. And so it's no surprise, I guess, that his employees didn't go off and mimic what he had done. I don't know if that was just being respectful or just they all wanted to sort of flap their own wings and do what they wanted to do. But they spread all over the country, and he had done work all over the country. He has houses all over the country, which Mellor, Meigs, and Howe really didn't do. Addison Meisner didn't do. Adler did a little, but not a lot. Most of these people were confined locally. When you say Shaw did a bunch of stuff in Hyde Park, people say, wow, he went that far away. But Lindeberg was everywhere. Dayton, Ohio, he did work for the Pillsburys in Minnesota. He just did stuff all over the place. Santa Barbara, California, one project.
Did he do anything in Michigan?
Yes, he did. One of the floor plans, the Boyer Miller house, actually the owner of it called me a while ago and they said that they loved this house. They haven't touched it. It's very much exactly the way it was. He did about 5 projects in Michigan. And I think Farmington Hills, that area, which makes sense. He seemed to find the places where society was well-heeled.
Is there a picture of his own home?
Yes, and I I have a slide of it. If I put up that, it looked a lot like that. That's the Gardner residence. It had that sort of high roof. It had a limestone surround at the entry doorway. It made a sort of a U-shaped court toward the garden, very much like this house does. And I apologize. His garden facade looked a lot like this, except the distinction being that on his house, the central block, the center portion of the house, the roof sat up higher, and the wings that came forward had lower roofs. In the late 30s and 1940s, Lindeberg suddenly shifted and started doing roofs that had like a 3 or 4 and 12 pitch instead of 14 or 15 and 12, and started making houses that looked kind of like everybody else.
What was the economics of that time?
Yeah, it was expensive to make that much roofing. And he did a project. He did kind of a prototype house for the Weyerhaeuser Corporation, and he did designs for steel frame houses later on. There's no evidence that any of those were built, but he did it with steel panels to make the facades. And they were like that country house or country life house that you saw with that color rendering at the very end of the talk. Very boxy, flat roofs. But he developed all this detailing for it, I think, again, trying to figure out a way to sort of reconcile himself with a society that was changing speed faster than he could or than he wanted to. And frankly, I'm glad he didn't produce much in those years, because it might not have, but it might have actually detracted from what he did do. You don't have to, if you have projects with beautiful weather vanes, as an aesthetic person, you don't have to be a weather vane too. Yes, sorry.
On the undulations of the roof,
How did they do that, and did it help the way the water and the snow came off?
The undulation was entirely about visual effect, purely the picturesque effect of it seeming like a thatched cottage roof. And in those cases, he was using that Ludovisi clay tile, which wasn't flexible like the wood shingles that he used on other projects. So like at the Lawrence Armor, he could steam the shingles and make it look like thatch. But when he started using the Ludovisi tile and wanted it to have this sort of more aged character, the only way to do it was to build in those undulations under the tile.
With the picture, it didn't look that way.
If you actually see it in person, and unfortunately the photograph doesn't, none of the photographs sadly today really do justice to how nice these houses are, but I always end up scrambling to get the images like 2 weeks before the talks for this group, because I usually just go and see the houses in person. But the undulating effect is really, I think it works quite well. It's not, it doesn't feel artificial. He did it very well.
Tom, we thank you again.
Thanks very much.